benefit. But there are other possible explanations. Well, yes, I think so. Henry Tudor supporters as well would benefit. And Edward declared illegitimate, so born outside marriage, so king rightful no, so Richard feel like young boy alive there. Me personally evident. So accusation number 2. Richard, his wife, and murdered or poisoned. Now, why? People say why. I think personally, got him. And Richard, his son, died young, so Richard needed new air and boredom. Why? It showed God plan back then. But that false information. Why? Discussion before Richard died. Discussion possibility marry Portuguese princess, not niece. And well, remember, Edward's children declared illegitimate. So, accusation number 3. Richard, his middle brother, George, ability execution. Wow, bold information. Why it was Edward IV. George executed when in 1478. So before Richard ruled king, so not responsible. As well, George rebelled. So execute, and they think and why drown by. Okay, so accusation number 4. So Richard, England, Brown, he stole himself from the king. Now, maybe true, but Richard Crown offered by authorities, Commons and Lords. Crown offered. Why? Remember, Edward IV declared illegitimate. So now England king needed and quick, so they offered. But as well, a king first time Crown stole or usurped. No, to think about his brother Edward IV. Crown stole from Henry VI. As well, Henry Tudor did the same thing a bit later. So was Richard Crown except lovely. So now Shakespeare, a play wrote titled Richard III. Now Richard III shown how a good man, known again as a murderer, poisoner, executioner, Shakespeare wanted, no, he needed to write negative about Richard. So today I think saying propaganda, so loudly, Richard getting nothing. May